Good morning, everyone, and welcome to everyone in the room, and a special welcome to everyone who is joining us this morning via live stream. I'm Gary Loncki, and on behalf of our conference committee, I would like to, thank you for being here, and also we're very, very grateful to Richard for being here in person with us. Thank you, Richard. And be assured of our prayers for you. It is an honor for me to introduce our speaker. I first became acquainted with Richard Rohr when I was working as a communications director for the Diocese of Erie, Pennsylvania. About 25 years ago, I read an article that Richard wrote on 12-step spirituality. At about the same time, a priest friend loaned me a cassette tape titled The Spirituality of Imperfection. What Richard wrote and what he said really spoke to me. So much so that when the going got tough, as it sometimes does working in the church, I sent him a letter informing him of what I was going through. And I told him how his writings and tapes helped me through it. He actually took the time to reply to me. He sent me a newsletter, and at the top of the newsletter was a message in his handwriting, and it said, "Gary, stop and see me anytime." Well, Richard, that was 25 years ago. Call me a procrastinator, but I finally made it. Many of you are familiar with Richard, but for those of you who are not, Father Richard Rohr is a globally recognized ecumenical teacher, bearing witness to the universal awakening within Christian mysticism and the perennial tradition. He is a Franciscan priest of the New Mexico province and founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation, CAC, here in Albuquerque. Richard's teaching is grounded in the Franciscan alternative orthodoxy, practices of contemplation and lived kenosis, which is self-emptying, expressing itself in radical compassion, particularly for the socially marginalized. Richard is academic dean of the Living School for Action and Contemplation. Drawing upon Christianity's place within the perennial tradition, the mission of the Living School is to produce compassionate and powerfully learned individuals who will work for positive change in the world based on awareness of our common union with God and with all beings. Richard is author of numerous books, including The Naked Now, Immortal Diamond, Breathing Underwater, Falling Upward, and Eager to Love, The Alternative Way of Francis of Assisi. By the way, these books and many others will be available for purchase tonight during our tour of the Center for Action and Contemplation. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Father Richard Rohr.
Good morning. Well, a delight to be here. So nice to just drive down the road. And I honestly, mean this, can't think of any group that I would feel safer with, I think that's right, than women religious in general and communicators in particular. Because as you know, that's been the work of much of my life, is to try to make the great mystery, the great gospel, accessible at different levels. Instead of just always preaching to the choir, saying the same thing to people who either want to fight you about it or already agree with it, to, as Jesus said, preach the gospel to all nations, which I always assume means to somebody other than yourself. And that's your work, isn't it, as communicators, to try to make whatever we are, whatever it is we have to say, something good, true, attractive, and even beautiful for the larger world, which, as we certainly know today, is the suffering is just beyond belief. just how can this many people be involved in this much pain at the psychological level, the material level, in our country at the political level, where it just feels like, is this the best level of discourse? A country with this many universities, this many supposedly educated people, this many churches, it's political discourse, and I have to say, often our church discourse can seemingly be so infantile, and I don't know what other word to use. Now, the word I often use, and I'll try to take a little time to describe this, is dualistic thinking. If you did read The Naked Now, you know what I'm talking about. That I think it's the normal mode that people are educated into in the West, to see everything by comparison in terms of opposites and always choosing one side to be 100% right, which puts you in the terrible position of needing to prove that the other side is 100% wrong. That mind, sisters and brothers, just can't get you anywhere. Huh? And I'm convinced that religion, as Ken Wilber says, was meant to be and is at its higher levels a conveyor belt to lead you to the highest levels of consciousness, the highest levels of communion. And that's, by and large, what I want to talk to you about. Now, because you're the communicators for that religious life. One decision I've certainly never regretted in my life was joining the Cincinnati Franciscans when I was a young man. I was raised in Kansas, but went off to Ohio and Michigan to be educated with the friars, and then came out here 29 years ago to start the center. So this has been my home base for the last almost 30 years. But the reason I founded the center and recently the Living School was to try to communicate that to people who could be multipliers. You know, there's a terrible temptation in the Catholic world, but I think in most organized religion, to simply see religion as attendance. That you go to things like attend Mass on Sunday. Interesting that we even use that word. And, you know, it's a check on your resume. It doesn't necessarily transform your consciousness. Huh? It's largely a belonging system, a belief system, which is fine. But of itself, you can belong to anything and not have a transformed consciousness. And I do believe religious life, why it was founded in feminine and masculine forms again and again in the Catholic Church, to create some kind of breathing room on the edge of this imperial church, to allow people to take that ride on the conveyor belt. Now, I'm going to have a handout handed out to you in a moment, just so you'll have something to hang my remarks on that will feel like a objective, believable skeleton, because you've all heard, certainly if you were raised Catholic, 1,001 sermons in your life, and they might even inspire you once in a while, but inspiration of itself lasts about half an hour. And that's why we keep needing another fix and another fix, you know, because the half hour wore off. So we need another inspiring sermon. Well, I'm convinced that contemplation, I call it the change that changes everything. It doesn't teach you what to see, which is what by and large organized religion does. It teaches you how to see. You know? And then everything opens up, everything. And my almost synonym for the contemplative mind is the non-dual mind. So I believe that for any of you who happen to have read, you certainly don't need to, my book, Falling Upward, I try to describe in that book what I call the two halves of life. And I say, and that's not of itself chronological. There are very young people, usually by reason of suffering, who are already spiritually in the second half of life. And there's many elderly people who are not elders. They have not grown up. They still see everything in terms of black and white, with me or against me, which is a very egocentric way of seeing everything. So let me describe, first of all, very simply, this is an oversimplified, because I only have 1 hour with you, course on contemplation. The normal way that the Western mind works at this point in history, after centuries of fighting and argumentation and the Reformation and the Enlightenment and the need to be right in that those systems engendered, is that when an event, an idea, a new situation, a new person enters your field, and I don't ask you to believe me on this, I want you to watch your own mind. That part of the event, the situation, the person that you already are exposed to does not threaten you. You have been taught in your culture or your family, you agree with, in other words. That part of it you call true. I want you to recognize the narcissism in that. All right? Just because you're familiar with it and have been exposed to it doesn't make it true. But that's the way the unconverted, egocentric person thinks. That part of every event, situation, person, idea that you have not yet been exposed to, that threatens your ego, that is larger than your little field of control, is mystery, might I say, which everything truthfully is. But we don't have much patience with mystery for the last 500 years after the fights of the Reformation and the Enlightenment. So we all chose this position of dualistic thinking. You need to be totally right. I don't think Jesus ever said that, did he? Thou shalt be right. Please find the quote, all right? But we think that's a right we have, to be right. And then we spend the whole rest of our life trying to prove an impossible premise. That's largely a waste of time when the whole great spiritual journey begins with an awesome surrender to absolute mystery. Much more patient with mystery, with paradox, with ambiguity. But I didn't finish my earlier idea. Any part of a moment that comes toward you that you're not exposed to or you're threatened by, you call it false, heresy, wrong, sinful, dangerous. Pick your word. But listen to most politicians. That's almost the only way they talk. All fear-based, all anger-based, from the negative side of the choice. Now, what you're learning in early stage contemplation, and this takes years of practice because the mind is so wired, and you've got to rewire this, you're so wired to dualistically divide everything, is basically in your contemplative practice, you learn to stop doing that. And every time you're threatened to judgment, to analysis, to critique, to splitting, to dividing, you let it go. You let it go. That's why I was glad you used the word kenosis, self-emptying. Contemplative prayer is just, well, I'm going to say it in the worst possible way, not to make it too attractive. It's an assured exercise of daily failure. Now, if you're not into failure, if you're highly success-oriented, as most Americans are, you won't even try contemplation. You won't. You'll create some little prayer form that you can succeed at, right? I probably shouldn't say that on the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, but something mechanical, something physical. Actually, my two grandmothers, I think, became contemplatives by saying the Rosary in the fields of Kansas, so I'm not speaking against it. But I am saying anything that's too technique-y, anything that can give you the assurance, I've prayed, I said the office, shut the book, I've prayed, when in fact not one moment of communion might have happened during that time. You can recite prayers, you can say prayers entirely with a dualistic mind. As I said in that book, The Naked Now, when I was still living in Cincinnati, I used to take my yearly retreats down at Gethsemane, And the monks over the years got to know me. And in 1985, the abbot approached me and he said, "Richard, you've been chosen to give the community retreat. Would you do that?" And I said, "Me?" I mean, I looked young then. I had hair. I was a kid. And all the monks were my age. I am now. And I said, "Who am I to talk to these venerable contemplatives?" And he said, "Just 3 lectures a day for 8 days." Oh, I said, "Are you sure you want me?" And he said, "You're my choice and you're the choice of the community." So I did it. But some of you know the story I'm going to tell, but it is true. The first day I thought, because I was so youthful looking at that point and they were so old and contemplative, I had to earn my credit there. And the way to do that, if you're Catholic, is to quote auspicious, famous, saintly people, popes and mystics and doctors of the church, you know. So I thought, he was buried right outside the window where I was talking. The man to quote was the man himself that even Pope Francis quoted last week, Thomas Merton. And so first day I raised my authoritative, excited hand and said, as Merton himself said. And as soon as I said that, there was coughing all over the room. And as religious with habits love to do, they start rearranging their scapulars. And some looked out the window, and that's the male form of passive-aggressive behavior. When they want to let you know, I am no longer listening to you, they literally look away. It was only 2 or 3. But I thought it was just an accident. Something else had gone on in the room, surely these holy monks were not, no prophet being honored in his own country, or certainly it was not in-house jealousy, was it? So the next day I tried it again. As Merton said, the man so easy to quote on almost everything, and again, coughing, rearranging scapulars, looking out the window. And so Brother Bruno, who's now deceased but was a friend of mine, I pulled him aside in the hallway and I said, "What was going on there?" He said, "Well, Richard, you probably need to know. A lot of us didn't like Thomas Merton." Now, he did, but a lot of the others didn't. I said, "Really?" I said, "The whole world reads him." Now, this was his quote to show you how we've so hugely misunderstood contemplation. He said, "Merton told us we were not contemplatives." Now, mind you, these are people who've given their whole life to be contemplatives. He told us, now this is the exact quote, he told us we were not contemplatives, we were just introverts. Religious always laugh the most at that because you get it. You see, the introverted personality passed for the holy personality. Just because you like to be quiet doesn't mean you're loving Jesus. Do you understand? Still water, in fact, can run very deep. You might just be antisocial. So even when I use the word contemplation, I want you to say, what do I think? What do you think when I use that word? Now, here's the most common substitutes. Being prayerful, which is often people who are quiet, being quiet. Enjoying lots of alone time. He's so contemplative. Well, we found out, and I've given enough retreats to contemplative communities, male and female, that quietness can hold an awful lot of anger, rage, in fact, sometimes. So it's no proof of anything of itself. Reflecting on things seriously. That's probably the way the secular world would use the word contemplation. Having religious feelings. Oh, he's very contemplative. He's very pious, that might mean. Now, even that means being churchy more than it necessarily means being a gospel person. Perhaps it means pondering an issue quite seriously. The reason I call contemplation the change that changes everything is because it's a rewiring. It's a rewiring of this so you look at life as an open field. And you stop labeling everything up and down, Republican, Democrat, black, white, gay, straight, Catholic, Protestant, attractive, unattractive, for me or against me. Now that's going to take years of work, because that's the way you naturally operate. I'm sorry to have to tell you that, right? You do, unless you've done your work. Now the normal two paths of transformation are great love and great suffering. And those of themselves lead you, without realizing it, to non-dual consciousness. When you're in the middle of great pain, you don't have time to make great judgments or cruel judgments. When you're in the presence of great love, you at least for a while have overcome it. You don't. It's a regression at that point to be angry or hateful or judgmental. Now, what contemplation is a way of preserving that mind that you learned in great love and great suffering over the long haul. Because you can't maintain the honeymoon of love. You can't maintain the wisdom of grief over the long haul. You've got to find a way. What I learned there, I want to keep it permanently. This is the set of eyes through which I want to look at reality. Now, when I speak of the two halves of life, I'm saying what we're doing in the first half of life is by and large building our, as I use in that book, building our personal container, our ego structure, our self-importance, getting an education, getting a title. I became a Franciscan, a priest, got educated. This all told me Richard was wonderful. Isn't he significant, important? He's got security now. He's got status. You're going to take me seriously. You got to have a few initials after your name like we religious do, and a title in front if possible. Now, what happens, hopefully, and it will happen, is all of that window dressing, and that's all it is in the creating of your container. Normally in the middle years of life, it falls away. You realize it is just window dressing. It's what Thomas Merton would call the false self. It's not who you really are, it's just a way of getting to who you really are. And it's probably the best way, by far, the best way to get started. Which is why conservative people people who start conservative tend to grow up the best. Because they have a few givens, a few standards, a few objective criteria on which they base their life. It's not a movable feast like it is, or movable famine like it is for so many of our young people today, where there's no solid ground anywhere. And I've got to create it. Ooh, that's a hard way to grow up. But it still has to fall apart. And that's called, in our Christian language, the confrontation with the cross. With absurdity, with tragedy, with non-logic, with non-necessity. I mean, Jesus, he's only 30 and the whole thing's over. And there isn't a lot to show for it at that point. I mean, everything in his logical mind must have said, this is an absurd universe, especially if I'm the Son of God. You're all, if you're on schedule, sisters and brothers, you're going to face that falling apart. So I want you to picture 3 boxes. Some people think better if you give them a geographic or a geometric image. First box is order. That's the easiest way to start. To build a world with some meaning, some purpose, some direction, and some ground. The second box, damn it, is disorder. Ooh. That's what we're promised. Why we're signed with the cross. This is given. And then we even more foolishly say we're saved by the cross. That if you can trust the second box, you get to the third box, which is reorder. So order, disorder, reorder. Now what conservative people tend to do, and I certainly did, was spend most of the first half of life trying to secure and validate and rebuild the first box, over and over and over again. What liberals and progressives and academics and smart and sophisticated people like most of us probably are, we get trapped in the second box and we become cynical. We become angry. We become split. We become disillusioned. You see, where we deeply need wisdom is how to traverse you from the first box to the third box. Reorder, or the resurrected life. Sisters and brothers, I got to say as strongly as I can, and you know it, so I probably don't need to say it to you, but there's no nonstop flight from box 1 to box 3, okay? Sorry. No way. You don't get to the resurrected life by avoiding all tragedy, absurdity, suffering, meaninglessness, death. That's where you learn everything. A few of you probably saw my interview with Oprah last year, and maybe you noticed, a lot of people wrote me about it. We really connected. I was back there a few weeks ago again at her house, and we sort of like one another. But when I said success has nothing to teach you after the age of 30, did you see the blank look on her face? And it was the only moment of pushback. Father Richard, now let's talk about that. I'm not sure I understand that. Of course she couldn't. She's a billionaire. She's an American. It's all about success. Climbing. So to preach the folly of the cross, which is what? Our second half of life, and this is what I'm leading up to, that I think religious life is made to order to lead you to the second half of life. It's a second half of life institution. But here's the difficulty you probably have as communicators. You've got to appeal. Oh, you're going to hate me for saying this, but it's true. You've got to appeal to people who are still largely in the first half of life. I remember the little booklet that the Cincinnati Franciscans sent out to me in the 1950s, so I'd come to the seminary there. And it was all about the swimming pool and how much fun we'd have at the seminary. That's the only way you can get a teenage boy to consider religious life. He isn't ready for death yet. No way, and nor should he be. God has mercifully kept us from the realization. So religious life of itself is a second half of life institution to raise up mature, contemplative people. So now I'm going to bring together the two things. I believe maturity and the contemplative mind are the same thing. That when you read reality in a non-judgmental, compassionate, open-field way. Now, if you don't mind, if you hand out those papers, and they won't be reading them while I'm talking, okay? Any of you who've been exposed to, we still got time to do it, very quickly, any of you who've been exposed to spiral dynamics are going to be somewhat familiar with this. Spiral dynamics is being used actually by our own government, by corporations. It's built on the century-long developmental theory of Piaget, Fowler, Kohlberg, Carol Gilligan, Erik Erikson. Actually, as a Catholic, I would say it's built upon John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila and John of the Ladder, all of who, without calling it that, were developmental psychologists. If you can't recognize there's a direction to growth, there's a meaning to maturity, you're in trouble. Because what happens is very immature people get away with saying things in the name of God that have nothing to do with God. Do we need much proof of that? It's everywhere. It's everywhere. Highly narcissistic people will basically hijack God to even more promote their own agenda, their own purpose, their own goal. Now, spiral dynamics is the most recent iteration of all of this century of developing when Erikson and Fowler and Kohlberg, all end up saying things that are highly similar. You can put one paradigm on another, and they're all saying, at the lowest level, you're highly dualistic, judgmental, angry, either or, tribal thinking. And at the highest level, to use our language, you're a mystic, where you can actually do stupid things like love your enemies. See, we've told people at the lower levels, as you can see from the paper now in front of you, they use colors to teach this just for the sake of quick identification, sort of like we did with the Enneagram numbers, you know. You need quick identification. But when you're teaching people at the purple and red levels, or even the blue level, to love their enemies, goes right over their head. There's no capacity to understand that, no capacity to agree with that, much less capacity to do that. Because your thinking is all the good guys and the bad guys, and let's kill the bad guys. Let's get rid of the bad guys. Let's exclude the bad guys. So, very quickly I'm going to go through it so I can come back to it and show you how the contemplative mind is not just the fruit of conversion and real transformation, but in fact, it's the unique form of communication of religious life. And if you need much proof of that, when Pope Francis visited our country last week, he blew the minds of everybody, right? Jim Wallace, my lifelong friend, the editor of Sojourners, he called me 3 days ago, and he said, Richard, never has a visitor come to Washington, D.C. and had such an effect, because he changed the frame of how we talk about almost everything. Didn't tell us how to talk, didn't tell us what to say, but how to talk. And that's the fruit of contemplation. So let's go through it quickly. And please, this will not remain heady or abstract or academic. It's actually charting the mansions of Teresa of Avila. It's charting the nights of John of the Cross. The lowest level, I'm sure all of us are well beyond the purple level, magical animistic forces of good and evil that we can control by technique and formula. Much of medieval religious life. Filled monasteries. At that level, you're largely fear-based. It's all about going to heaven or going to hell. It's totally dualistic thinking. So, of course, you're going to join a monastery rather than burn for all eternity by a God who at that point is not very loving at all, who doesn't follow Jesus' own commandments to love your enemies. This God doesn't, right? Or to forgive 70 times 7, this God doesn't. But it works. Purple level people hold together. You know, whereas when you get up to these higher levels where we are, of course we are, we don't hold together very well because we're not motivated by fear anymore, you see. All right. So there's not much indication of any real inner transformation, except in a very few. I'm sure some of you have been to Europe, and you go the amount of monasteries, the amount of ruined monasteries. I mean, it must have been one of every 10 people was a monk or a nun. They were everywhere. That's one of the reasons for the Reformation. We controlled the real estate of Europe, you know. And it was very popular to join because you were going to save your soul. Now, this whole mentality of saving your soul, I started there too, is it is just fire insurance. It's not love of God, all right? It doesn't even approach the gospel. It's delayed self-interest. That's all it is. Delayed self-interest passing for love of God. But most people at least move to the red level. Now, instead of just my little totems and talismans and medals and magic bearing of Joseph's statues in the backyard where it's all magical, you move to the red level. At least I joined the right group, where everything is about belonging. Now, a lot of us grew up there. You got to go through all these, right? You got to. You can't jump over any of them. Belonging to the right group is everything. It's competitive, it's nationalistic, and you're willing to fight for it. The red level is rather violent. This is the Crusades. You're going to see history go through all these stages. Some of this, of course, lasted till the 20th century. Tends toward absolutist thinking and totally legitimated violence. You are a good guy for beheading the infidels. I don't need to talk about. All religions go through this, not just Christianity, and some are still there. It's the jihad mentality, and if I belong to the right group, I can behead the infidels without one moment of guilt. In fact, remember what Jesus says in John's Gospel? When you kill me, you will think you are doing a holy duty for God. Violence becomes virtue at the red level. So that's why, notice I have my little parentheses in there. You have to undergo a minor death. Now, the vast majority of people will at least undergo that minor death to get from the red to the blue, to get beyond their early, violent, totally nationalistic. This is, the far right in almost all countries. But most of us were probably, those of you who did go off to religious life, or those of you who even took on these wonderful jobs in religious life, you were probably at that stage at the blue level. Believe the myth of Franciscanism for me. And you love order inside of that. I wore my brown robe nonstop for 13 years. We even slept in it. We played baseball in it. And I wore it at Mass this morning. I can still do that. I know who I am there, but I don't need it to know who I am. But I don't throw it out. And I'm going to give you a principle that I want you to hold on to. As we transcend to the higher or more mature levels, you include. In fact, the sign that you have transcended is that you can include. You don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, even though you don't put your whole identity there. But the blue level is the true believer. This is the happiest level by far. As long as everybody conforms and you stay in your own ghetto. I mean, when I was a young Franciscan, before Vatican II, and the birth of critical thinking in the Catholic Church, or the orange level, God, we laughed a lot. You old religious can remember that. We were all in our habits. We were on time for everything. We all conformed. We were pious and sweet, well, sort of, externally at least. And we were always just telling jokes, The blue level is delightful. Amish people are very happy as long as they stay just in the Amish community, If they got a dialogue with the rest of Pennsylvania, they go crazy. Do you understand? You've got to stay in your ghetto to stay at the blue level. Almost all of us who joined religious life, as I said, and the irony is that so many who became bishops and priests in the last 15 years are feverishly and understandably holding on to the blue level. But I remember giving a retreat this was 20 years ago, to a diocese in Connecticut. And the bishop pulled me to his side and he said, Richard, we were in the dining room. He said, look at this room. He said, sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing in ordaining some of those guys. He said, see all those in that circle over there in the corner? They're all in their collars. And he said, they all ran toward that table because they can only talk to one another. They can't talk to the rest of the priests of the diocese. They don't really know how to talk to women or children or ordinary people. All they can do is talk to themselves. So that's when you're feverishly circling the wagons, you see, to reconfirm the first box. Order. And blue level has a wonderful and very gratifying sense of order. Honestly, and I mean this sincerely, the only reason I could move beyond it is because I enjoyed it for so many years. Do you follow? You've got to pay your dues to the blue level. You've got to be loyal to something. You've got to love something. And that's why I say transcend and include. Those of you who've remained in religious life, you still saw a value to belonging and to commitment And those of you who are married, faithfulness to your vows. Every one of these levels has its own value, and you don't throw any of them out. You just expand them. Can you stay with me? You're just going to keep expanding, huh? So the blue level is a foundational yes to what is. It's okay. Original blessing instead of original sin. Reality is the kingdom of God, is the place of God. I don't need to hate anything. I don't need to expel anything or exclude anything. But most conservatives get trapped here. Although fundamentalism or the Tea Party mentality is much more even red or purple, which is why our Congress has become absolutely unworkable. When you have that many red and purple people at the highest levels of government, non-negotiation is their agenda. Non-dialogue is their philosophy of life. You can't form community with red and purple people. It's all about kill the enemy, destroy the enemy. Now, what happened at the Protestant Reformation, in an initial way, much more at the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, and we Catholics pretty much held on to the blue level till 1965, right? And we had our marvelous thing called Vatican II, which introduced what I'm going to call here the orange level to the Catholic Church. Now, I'm going to say right, before you think I'm going to idealize it, a lot of people got stymied and stopped there, where you suddenly revel in critical thinking, dismissive thinking. I'm not that. The birth of rational, I'm just going to read from the text here, the birth of rational critical thinking, self-critical. Much of Vatican II was an explosion at this level. And thank God the Catholic Church entered the 20th century in the 1960s, or we would have found ourselves utterly incapable of dialoguing with the entire rest of the world. It's not a very happy level. If some of you are chronically unhappy, sorry to say, you're probably trapped at the orange level. Because there's a reason, there's an issue to be angry about every day. That's the second box. Liberals get trapped in the second box, conservatives get trapped in the first box. And both of them, by reason of that, avoid the third box, real transformation, the resurrected life. There's too much cynical dismissal of everybody and everything. Yet we must go through it. This is the classic sophomore in high school or sophomore in college. It's the very meaning of sophomore, wise fool, as you know. The sophomore has a new explanation for everything, and it's absolutely right. Tends to be anti-faith because of its insistence on knowing. You see, faith is that beautiful balance of knowing and not knowing, and not even needing to know. That's the freedom God gives you when you live in the heart of God. God knows. I don't need to know. I can't do that on my bad days either. But on the days when God holds me, I can. I don't need to know. God knows. It's a wonderful gift. It's the only way you can be happy. I'm raising my right hand. It's the only way you can be happy. If you think you've got to explain who's right and who's wrong, who's bad and who's good, if you've got to choose any ideology, from communism to fascism to rigid capitalism to rigid feminism, all of them are choosing sides, and spending your life proving. See, the burden you have once you choose sides is you've got to pretend your group is 100% wrong, and forgive my language, the other 100% are total bastards. They're not. They're still children of God. But you don't know that at the orange level. Your rationalism, your need for certitude, your need for absolute rational order can make you anything but compassionate or anything but patient. This is the technocrat. This is most of the young Turks in the American business world. It's all about efficiency, effectiveness, competition, control, winning. Remember when I was still in Cincinnati and I had to speak at a morning prayer breakfast for a group of rich Catholic businessmen. And I could see they were resisting me just a little bit. And I said, what if the gospel is actually a win-win worldview? And there was major pushback. No, pullback. And at the break, this wonderful Cincinnati businessman came up and drummed his fingers right here in front of me. Father, Father, in a very patronizing way. Father, Father, like Martha, you know. He said, come on, win-win, that wouldn't even be interesting. See, that's the American worldview. It's all win-lose. And when you have only men preaching the gospel for 2,000 years, even the gospel itself, the great good news, the cosmic Christ, is interpreted in terms of win-lose, in which by our own definition, hardly anybody wins. Hardly anybody does it right. That's why I wrote that spirituality of imperfection. We don't come to God by doing it right, or no one comes to God. We come to God by doing it wrong. By our vulnerability, by our sin, our imperfection, our tragedy, our absurdity, our humiliations. Those are the things that teach you everything you need to know after 30. You just need a few successes to get started, that's all. But the second half of life is entered into by the confrontation with the cross. Now, the green level. Probably a lot of us in this room are green. Now, I'm not talking about ecological green right now. I hope you're ecologically green too. This largely began to explode in the late 1960s. It was the hippie movement, the birth of the liberals. Most of us didn't even know what the word liberal was in 1961, you know. We were all happily at the blue level together. The green level is the birth of the pluralistic, sensitive individual. I want to emphasize the word individual. It knows little about belonging, community, commitment. It's all just protect the equal rights of everybody, which of course we're all for. I hope you're for. So it's like you want to get people to this pluralistic green level, and we call it political correctness. Dang it, Donald Trump is even misusing this word, but it's like there is nothing higher than human equality. Nothing higher. There actually is. It's the second tier, the mystical level. But here's the arrogance and the danger of the green level. And we got to get people there. But they are so smug, so sophisticated, so educated, so self-satisfied. I'm going to pick on the stereotypical city. I know it isn't true. I've taught there, but Boston, you know? Any Bostonians here? They're so smart. You know, they're so smart, and they're so academic, and they're so exposed, and they're so cosmopolitan, and they're so right. You see, it becomes its own problem. It's a combination of immense individualistic arrogance. I know. And everybody beneath me is a ridiculous, superstitious Catholic, and everybody above me I know nothing about. You see, that's their self-enclosure. They know nothing about the mystical level. You know, they know nothing about the true solidarity in the Spirit, that the whole world is the suffering of God. That's a second tier knowing, huh? The whole world is the suffering of God. You'd say that to a Hillary Clinton, you know, it was a wonderful green candidate, you know, but you would know nothing about the mystical level. Do you understand? Where it's actually beyond winning, beyond being right, beyond being politically correct, beyond saying the right thing. Like our Pope Francis, you can actually say the wrong thing, you know, and it's okay. You don't need everybody to like you. You don't need to be popular. That's certainly the burden of running for office. You got to get elected, you know, so you got to say the right thing. I do the same thing. So most liberals and academics today get trapped at either the orange or the green level. Now, we use a rather telling phrase. We call them mean greens. Have you ever met a mean green? These are liberals who can be just as cruel and go for the jugular vein. I get the most hateful letters from people who, if I don't put their liberal cause front and center as the only purpose of the Center for Action and Contemplation, they will just cut me in shreds. You're just a phony. You're just a patriarchal pig like all the rest of them. Yeah, I probably am, but where does this come from? The need to humiliate, defeat. Well, they're still living in the win-lose world, the dualistic mind, you see. So notice, I'm going to have to rush now, you have to undergo a major death of the ego to move to the second tier. So many people will resist this, including religious, including most clergy and bishops. Who wants to undergo? And here's what the major death to the ego feels like. Right? The loss of a sense of your radical separateness and your superiority. Can you really let go of any little window dressing that makes you feel superior? I am who I am, who I am, who I am, who I am, who I am. I faced my nakedness, and my nakedness is me. And this is what, for some wonderful, beautiful reason, transformative reason, God loves and God accepts. That's radical conversion. This is the dark night of the soul. Most people will not let go of their radical separateness and will not go of their basic superiority. So usually you have to have gone through a number of humiliations, failures, sufferings to do this. This doesn't happen in one fatal swoop. It's usually many surrenders. Women, frankly, tend to be much better at this than men. If you read male biographies, that we've always got to be knocked off our horse, We've always got to have whereas you read women's biographies, which are always boring to men. Did you know that? Because it's all just these little stories about a little suffering, a little loneliness, a little defeat. And it doesn't seem anything important to us men. Do you understand? We need a big defeat, something worth talking about, worth writing a book about, not just you were lonely for 2 days or something like that, I want to say that because you might think by a major death of the ego that this is one fatal swoop. It's usually a slow transformation. And the reason they call this spiral dynamics, the word is very well chosen. And I am sorry I don't have time to be longer with you and let you ask questions, but this is not a straight line. It's a spiral. You get it, you lose it, you get it, you lose it. You experience a momentary stage of mystical consciousness, then you get angry the next day after your 8-day retreat, and you just hate yourself. God, did I learn anything? I've had so many wonderful God moments where I said, I'll never forget this one. We're together. We're in the mystical marriage, Lord. You and I are one. And 3 days later, I'm right back into, it's so humiliating to know that even that experience you tried to make into an ego possession. So God has to engineer the major death. You cannot engineer it. It will be done unto you, as our Mary says. So the yellow level is big picture people, the beginnings of unitive consciousness. I and the Father are one. It's no longer competitive. And this might surprise or even disappoint some of you. You tend to lose your anti-authoritarianism at the yellow level. Orange and green spend all their life thinking all evil in the world is in authority, which is a scapegoat mechanism to avoid their own complicity in evil, their own shadow side, as Carl Jung would say, and we all do it. But Ken Wilber is the one who introduces this phrase. He says, believe it or not, at the mystical level, you reintroduce the appreciation of elders and beginners and you don't have to place yourself in one or the other. But if you find a wise person, you will beat a path to their door. Doesn't matter if they're male or female, old, young, black, white, gay, straight. All those labels mean nothing at this level. Nothing. They're just accidental, you see. And women will even come to talk to a priest, believe it or not. Because maybe even if he's done his journey. It's not because he's a priest. It's because he has something to say, or she has something to say, which is why so many women are such wonderful spiritual directors today. So the yellow level is the birth of the contemplative mind. The turquoise level, I certainly don't think I'm fit to describe either of these. That's why my last third of the book, Falling Upward, is probably the shortest, because I don't know that I've earned the right to talk about it. I hope I've stepped my toe in it. I hope God is leading me there. On certain days, I seem to enjoy unitive consciousness, where I and God are working together as one team, and God is no longer over there, but in here. Those are wonderful days, as you all know. But pretty much you stop counting. One scholar said of Therese of Lisieux, who's my favorite after St. Francis himself, of course, that what Therese introduced to the Christian world was the death of mathematics. We stopped counting. Who's worthy, who's unworthy, who's right, who's wrong. This much sin, this many days in purgatory. That whole game of counting belongs at the red and the purple level, frankly. So true mystical consciousness is full integration of both good and bad within yourself, within others, within society. Now you can love enemies. Now you can overlook offenses. So, forgive me for making this so oversimplified, but that's why I did want to give you a handout so you'd have something to hang on to after you left. But here's, I hope, my message for you. That I believe you're in a wonderful, and I do mean wonderful, position to represent women who have made it their whole life journey, whether they knew it or not, to get to the mystical level. Almost all of us who came had that initial enchantment, allurement, attraction of wanting to be, as we would have put it, one with Jesus. United with Jesus. And we were right. That is the goal. That's unitive consciousness. But there are very few structures in the world that are really programmed to move you there, to hold on to you during the second box, the disillusionment stage, the darkness stage, the disbelieving, cynical stage. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not against the parish system, but of itself, the parish system is not equipped to do that, right? And I know this from giving years of retreats to diocesan priests. And God bless them, many of them are so heroic and so dedicated. But what they have to do is sort of speak to where the people are at. And most of the people want to be reassured at the blue level. A few want to be reassured, believe it or not, at the red and purple level. Very few these days. Thank God Vatican II did its work. But the young sophisticates who've largely stopped coming want to be reassured at the orange level, that science is good, business is good, capitalism is good, success is good. And I'm not going to say they're not. But they're, as Pope Francis says, they are limited goods. And we in our country have made them absolute goods. And that's the lie. And that's what the gospel has given you. So let me put it this way, sisters and brothers. I think we enjoy a certain structural freedom. Maybe you've never thought of it that way, that most people don't enjoy. I would have been stopped, even when I was still in Cincinnati. Archbishop Bernardin, who became Cardinal Bernardin in Chicago, was then the Archbishop. And like I said, I had no status. I looked like a kid. He called me in one time. He said, well, here's the file we have on you, Richard. and I was at least 10 inches high. And he said, I've checked it out with my theologian. He says, we can't find any heresy in there. You do talk a little differently. He said, you talk in an informal platform manner, but that's okay. He says, I think you love the gospel, and I want you to know you've got an open door here. As long as you and I keep in contact, you keep preaching the gospel. Now, very few people get that kind of structural freedom and protection. I would have been stopped years ago. But the ongoing protection, quite frankly, is because I'm a Franciscan, right? And every time the Vatican came, or even the local bishop came, my blessed provincial, I've gone through 6 of them now, they always stop it at the door. They say, what's your problem with Richard? I'm not making this up. We don't have any problem with Richard. We think he's preaching the gospel. You do? Yes, we do. Is there anything else you want to say, Bishop? And of course, our provincials, we encourage them to take advantage of the freedom that we have. I mean, we Franciscans were here in New Mexico 200 years before any bishop was here, you know. So we're going to say, you know, we've earned the right to speak. We know what we're talking about, what the gospel is and how it works, and how very often it doesn't work when it's not preached in a liberating, life-giving, and free way. But I am quite sure if I had not been protected by the structural protection of the Franciscan order, I would not be standing here in front of you today. Now, maybe some of you wish I were not standing in front of you here today. But I don't think we recognize. I was just over in Bingen in Germany last month, and saw these ancient images of Hildegard, our latest doctor of the church. And perhaps you know, I mean, she wore a mitre and held a crozier. Huh? That in the 11th century, the autonomy of women's communities was so trusted and allowed and encouraged, you know. That only stopped in the late 12th century, if I have my numbers right, where we took those mitres and croziers out of the hands of women, you know, and said, no, you don't have that. But the older church, and we Catholics love to say we're traditionalists. Well, the first 1,000-year tradition gave immense autonomy and authority to communities of women. And the authority came precisely from being in community, that you weren't speaking as loners. Huh? So whatever you do as communicators, try to communicate the wisdom of the second half of life. Try to communicate the change that changes everything, the contemplative mind. Religious life will last, not in its older form, I'm sure, insofar as it is creating contemplative people. And when people see people like Pope Francis, who actually seem to process reality in a third way, not fight or flight, but a third synthesized, integrated way that feels like gospel, they will come running, because our world still recognizes wisdom, and I believe women's religious life in particular, and I'm not saying this to flatter anybody, but we male communities, we got so tied up with ordination. Francis did not want us to be priests. He never accepted ordination, because he knew once you accept that then you're a company man. Yeah? You've got to speak the party line. There's a whole bunch of things you can't say. So the brothers' communities and the sisters' communities have often enjoyed a double dose of structural freedom. By your very commitment to community, it has allowed you to say things that I believe are very close to, if not, the gospel. Thank you. Thank you. God bless you. Thank you.
guess you might say I'm the bag man. Richard, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We were really wowed by it. Thank you so much. And I'll bring this to the table, but on behalf of the Communicators for Women Religious, we'd like to extend to you this token of our appreciation. Thank you once again.